Well, hey everyone, welcome back. Today I'd like to talk about the most important issue in the 2020 presidential election. As you can see by your screen here, I'm talking about the national debt. Titles like the one that I put on this video oftentimes are, let's say, they're clickbaity. They exaggerate the importance or the severity of whatever the video is about. But I think I actually underplayed the title of the video. In essence, I believe that it is an issue that's been important for the past, 4 or 5 presidential elections. But it's important today, and it's the most important going forward, in my prediction. So the national debt is a bit of a web. It's a bit complicated when you start breaking it down. But let's start from the beginning, shall we? The national debt is the accumulation of all the debts that the federal government has racked up. You can think of it akin to a credit card debt or a loan, but the mechanism is a little bit different. So when the United States wants to get more money, wants to raise more funds, one of the big things it does is it sells treasury bonds. And these treasury bonds have interest rates attached to them. Let's say the average American citizen, they can purchase U.S. treasury bonds with a certain interest rate attached to them. And then in 5 to 10 years, the U.S. government will pay back the money with the interest on top of it. And now these bonds can be sold to obviously much more than just citizens or individuals. Institutions buy them, international governments buy them, ETFs buy them. They're part of investment vehicles. Who else? Companies buy them. It's considered a very solid investment, and I think by the time that we're done here, you might see where this sort of investment is probably not as strong and reliable as you would think, as what most people think it is. But so the debt is divided into 2 different categories. You have your debt held by the public, which is treasury securities held by investors outside the federal government. And this can be people, corporations, the Federal Reserve, and foreign states. Even local governments buy U.S. Treasury bonds. And then another organization that holds Treasury bonds, and that is the federal government itself. One of the big examples of this is the Social Security Trust Fund. That is we'll call it a debt that the United States government considers, for itself. And that, I think, highlights another problem with the whole system. The Social Security Trust Fund is basically just a large debt that the government owes itself. But Social Security is probably a subject for another day, but it is part of this weird debt system that the government has going, and it's one of the reasons that Social Security is not solvent in the long run. But here we go. We have our basics here. Basically, the United States government, in order to raise more money, it sells treasury bonds with an interest rate attached to it. And this is usually to fill the gap between the amount of money that it wants to spend and how much money it can pull in with taxes. So a little bit later, I'm going to go through a few charts that I created, and all of the numbers that I use, I pulled from the Congressional Budget Office, this webpage right here. Why is the government debt bad? There's a few main options here. So, government spending pushes out private sector investment and economic activity. And I think this is pretty reasonable to say, just because if the government is spending money on education, healthcare, housing, or anything else. These are economic transactions that can no longer be done by the private sector because they've been taken over by government spending. Now, whether you find this desirable or not, I guess depends on what part of the political spectrum you fall on. But overall, I think it's hard to argue against the fact that government spending pushes out private economic activity, and I would argue that that hurts overall American economy, or any economy rather. So another issue here is that when the federal government when the federal government sells treasuries to the Federal Reserve, it has the effect of increasing the monetary supply in the economy. This is because the Federal Reserve doesn't have any money of its own. It has to print the money in order to purchase these assets. And so this is new money that enters the economy. And when more money enters an economy, it's more money chasing the same amount of goods and services. So when it all balances out, a single dollar is worth less at the end of that series of events. The Federal Reserve also does this with assets and investment vehicles from Wall Street in order to bail them out and to manipulate interest rates and, to try to goose the economy. This is what they call quantitative easing. But that's also new money that enters into the economy that basically steals value from all the rest of us, because it starts, this is true trickle-down economics, where the Federal Reserve purchases assets from these large financial corporations. They get the money first. They get to spend it first and get the full value of the new dollars. And then as it reaches down to the rest of us, those dollars are worth less, and any money that we have saved is worth less. But let's get back on topic, though. And then finally, I think what is perhaps the most dangerous, or what we're hurling towards pretty quickly, is the interest on the debt. So obviously, the United States government has to pay back the treasuries to the individuals or organizations that purchase them at a premium at these interest rates. So that places a burden on the federal budget every year. And as you can see here on the screen, you can read through a little bit of what this article is saying, and I think it mirrors a lot of what I'm saying. But now that the overall debt is large enough, the cost of the interest every year is quite substantial. So the World Bank says that countries that reach a debt level close to their GDP becomes a investment risk. And I think that's a real threat now, because the United States federal debt is around 23 trillion, and the size of the U.S. economy is, I think it's about that size. It's 21, 22 trillion. I might be a little off, but they're at the same level. They're very close. And when this happens, treasuries become to look less appealing when investing in them. And so the U.S. government's ability to borrow money at some point will be diminished. That is important because the interest rate itself is going to be a huge liability. So let me move to my chart here. This is kind of a picture of how the economy is growing, then the level of spending that we have versus the level of tax revenue that the U.S. government has. So the yellow line here is GDP, which is a measurement of all the goods and services that are produced in the economy. And then we have the other two lines here, the green line being government spending, and the blue line being the amount of money that the government actually brings in. And the first thing we can notice here is that most of the time the U.S. government spends more than it takes in. And we can see right at the 2008 mark, when President Obama came into office, there was a large spike in government spending and a drop in revenue Obviously, the revenue part of it is because the Great Recession occurred then, and that has continued. That deficit has continued up until Trump's administration in the present day, and it looks like it's not going to change anytime in the future. One thing I did notice as I was putting this table together, that revenue versus GDP, how much revenue the government is able to pull out of the economy, kind of caps out at 18 to 19%. Since the 70s, we've had a variation of tax rates and schemes. The Democrats have been in charge. Republicans have had a shot too several times in this time. But regardless of who is in power, it seems that the most juice you can squeeze out of the GDP or out of the economy is 18 to 19% of GDP. And I think this is important when you look to consider the claims from various presidential candidates about just increasing taxation to fund their various programs that often cost much more than the programs that we have today are. And now to the cost of the national debt year to year. So I thought it'd be useful to compare it to some of the big ticket items that the federal government spends money on nowadays. And that's the interesting thing, because the interest payment is approaching the size of these programs, which is very scary. And if we stay on the path that we're on, it will start eclipsing the costs of these programs and pushing them off the budget. So in 2019, the interest on the debt is $375 billion. Military spending is $719 billion. Social Security is about $1 trillion. Medicare is about $775 billion. Medicaid is $409 billion. And so going forward, as all of these expenses rise, by 2025, the cost of the interest on the debt will overtake Medicaid. We will be throwing more money into a fire on a year-to-year basis than we put into Medicaid, at least on these projections. And so that's incredibly scary, because we're just going to have to borrow more money in order to make room in the budget for all these programs that we want to spend money on. Well, I don't want to spend money on them, but it looks like everybody else wants to, especially Bernie Sanders. And I think his platform is the most scary when considering the points that I'm bringing up now. But so by 2030, interest will cost us $819 billion. The military will be at $937 billion. Social Security will be at $2 trillion. It's pretty easy to see that program is going to go broke. And perhaps I'll talk about that some other time. Medicare is at $1.7 trillion, and Medicaid will reach $732 billion. These are very scary numbers. And when I see a lot of presidential candidates making promises to strengthen these programs and to spend more money on them, I only fear that the interest rate, the cost of interest on the debt will go up more quickly, because the debt will go up more quickly because I will have to borrow more money in order to catch up and make more space in the budget. But there's another layer to this as well. If you don't follow the Federal Reserve, then this will be new to you. But the Federal Reserve has been holding interest rates at artificially low levels for a long time. And these interest rates influence the interest on these securities that the Federal Reserve owns, and that securities are sold at in general. But when the Federal Reserve is finally forced to raise interest rates, the cost of the debt, the interest payments, will skyrocket and will become completely unmanageable. And so I guess that leads me to the final thing that I want to say. There's a lot of pundits and there's a lot of people out there talking about how our democracy, our society is split, and we're very polarized, and it's difficult to speak to the other side of the aisle. And while that is very true, I think a much more troubling development is that both sides think that scarcity is gone. They think that money is no object. The Republicans increase spending when they're in power. The Democrats increase spending when they're in power. Only a few years ago, there were these budget battles about passing continuing resolutions to just run the government. For the past 20 years, at least, the United States has only ever passed a budget properly maybe twice. Every other time, it's a last-minute deal to raise the debt ceiling, and usually to get the deal passed, they just agree to spending that each side wants, and they just agree to spend all the money on everything that they want in order to compromise to raise the debt ceiling. So this is a much more, I would say, existential threat than anything else we got. Climate change, sure, it's a threat. I think it's a little bit further out than the budgetary threat that we're facing here. One way to look at it is we must reduce spending, or otherwise a lot of people will be hurt. You know, these Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they're all running out of time. Social Security is eating into the trust fund this year. The trust fund being the money that the federal government owns itself. And people my age are not expecting to use Social Security. And a lot of this is due to demographic changes. But basically, we need to correct now. We need to feel a little pain now to have some financial stability and to balance the budget before we can ever balance it. And then these programs will not be able to fund themselves, and people will be dropped from them, and they will be injured in a real, tangible way. These sorts of things are never sustainable because we all like to get stuff. Reducing the money expended on these programs, even in order to make them sustainable, will get you heavily criticized and demonized. I remember a handful of years ago, I believe it was Paul Ryan, he was Speaker of the House, I believe, and he was writing up a budget trying to save these programs, trying to contain the explosion in costs to make them sustainable. And I don't think the cuts were even that much, but there was a commercial, or let's say campaign commercial, taken out against him of a man in a suit pushing a woman in a wheelchair off of a cliff. Like, literally. A dude was walking up to the end of a cliff with it was a fake woman in the wheelchair. But and throwing her off. And that was in response to him trying to be mildly responsible with the budgeting of Medicare and Medicaid. And so while I don't think we will ever have the real grown-up discussion about making our budget sustainable, I figure I have to, just to satisfy my conscience, I suppose. And that's the scary thing about Bernie Sanders. Let's run through his platform really quickly. So here, and I'm not going to drill down to this. This is on his official website. You can come here, you can take a look, you can read. But let's just look at the things that he's promising. Medicare for all, that will increase the costs to the government. I don't see how adding 30 million people to the healthcare system will be cheaper. Maybe that's something I need to look into. The Green New Deal, I think this is the one that AOC put out as well, something similar. But it is a whole host of spending bills and increased costs to the budget. College for all, obviously that costs more money. Expanding Social Security, That is a program that is designed to fail. It's just going to be due to demographics, basically, amongst, the fact that the government can't keep its hands out of the Social Security Trust Fund. Housing for all. We're going to pay for everybody's housing. We're going to put more into public education. Like we do that every year. I don't know what's going to be different. Eliminating medical debt. Okay, we have some taxation here. I think as we saw from the table before, there's a bit of a ceiling on how much money you could squeeze out of the economy. High-speed internet for all. More money. Legalize marijuana. I can get on board with that. Jobs for all. That sounds like a fairly costly government program as well, amongst other moral obligations I would have. But there you have it. This is what looks like the front runner for the Democrats in the presidential race. And, in that whole list, there's some, he's got some bullet points about increasing taxes, but the effectiveness of that will be limited because I think rich people will be able to hide their money regardless of how the tax system is set up. They're pretty good at doing that. There was no mention of reducing the federal debt, and it's really impossible to know the cost of his platform. And actually, now that I think about it, I have a little clip where he admits just that. So he was on a talk show recently. I guess it was CBS. And when he was asked about the cost of his platform, he didn't have an answer. Let's hear it from his mouth.
Your agenda has promised free health care for everybody, free college tuition, and to pay off people's college loans. The price tag for that is estimated to be $60 trillion over 10 years, correct?
Well, look, we have political opponents.
You don't know.
Come up.
You don't know how much your plan costs?
You don't know. Nobody knows. This is impossible.
You're going to propose a plan to the American people and you're not going to tell them how much it costs?
So that's pretty scary. I believe the appeal to him is very emotional, devoid of understanding how the federal government works, how it gets its money, where it gets its money, the ramifications for the actions that it chooses to take. And while I will not be voting in the 2020 election because I don't feel voting for the lesser of two evils will make anything better, a little part of me will prefer Trump overall. And that gives me no joy in saying. Well, that's all I have to say about that. Thank you for listening. I will talk to you later. Bye.